So before we learn about the idea that the tzaddik is a person that Hashem's presence dwells within him, is manifest through him, and that's how he inspires other Jewish people to have more of an awareness of Hashem, more of a consciousness of Hashem. And that's how we explain the idea of the going to a tzaddik to daven, going to a tzaddik for a bracha. So now we want to just touch on another part of the subject, which is also related. And we see this amongst Chassidim, that they make a big emphasis of something that, even a physical object that's somewhat connected to the Rebbe. This is the room where the Rebbe was, or this is an object that the Rebbe held in his hand. Where does that come from, and what's the basis for that? I remember reading a story. The story is being told by the previous Rebbe, that he once met an older Chassid, and the older Chassid said to the previous Rebbe that when I was a little boy, bar mitzvah, my grandfather took me to your great-grandfather for a bracha. And he said, your great-grandfather put his holy hands on my head and gave me a bracha, and then he ate it, and I still have the yarmulke that was on my head. I have that in my possession. So what? He touched it. Well, so why does that mean anything? And again, the most important thing is there a source for this? Where does this come from? So I want to go through some of the sources that actually clearly make this statement, and then we'll go into understanding it a little bit better. So the first thing is, if you go to page 50 in the booklet. This is the story in Parshas Chayesara where Avraham Avinu bought a piece of land and he was going to bury Sarah in the Moras HaMachpelah. So in the Pasuk, if you look on top of the page with Pasuk 17, it says, when he said that he bought the field, it says in Hebrew, Vayakom Sedei Ephron. So in English, they write, the field of Ephron was established as Avram's possession. Whoever knows Hebrew properly knows that Yakom means it stood up. And it's very unusual to use that term for an acquisition. What we're basically saying is he acquired the field. It became his. Why Vayakom? So Rashi writes, the field actually was elevated in importance. Again, we're talking about the field. Not something, not a human being, not an animal, but we're talking about something which is inanimate, a field. But nevertheless, it was elevated, it left the possession of a commoner and became the possession of a king. And we understand this deeper, not just a king. Avraham Avinu was like a king, but a tzaddik, a righteous person. So by the fact that it belonged to him, it was elevated. Which again means what? It means that there's a certain presence of godliness in the land. Let's see another example. Turn the page, it's page 51. This is the first pasuk in the Parsha Vayetze. And in the previous Parsha, it tells us how Yaakov lived in Be'er Sheva, and he left the city called Be'er Sheva, because Esav was after him, and he went to the city called Haran. So this parsha begins, Vayetze Yaakov meBe'er Sheva. If you look on top of the page, Yaakov left Be'er Sheva, and he went to Haran. So Rashi raises a question. If you're familiar with Rashi a little bit, Rashi is a very interesting commentary. He usually doesn't spell out the question. He just gives an explanation. But whenever Rashi gives commentary, it's usually because there's a question. And the commentators on Rashi are always searching, so what's the question that Rashi is coming to explain? And there's always something there that's not smooth, and Rashi is there to explain it. So the question here is obvious. But in this case, Rashi actually explains this question. And Rashi says, it had only to be written that Yaakov went to Haran. We know that he left Be'er Sheva. That's where he was before. So the Torah didn't have to say he left Be'er Sheva. We know from before he was living in Be'er Sheva, all it had to say was where he went. Why does the Torah mention where he left? But this tells us something. It teaches us that the departure of a righteous person from a place makes an impression. When a tzaddik leaves a certain place where he was living, it makes a difference. As long as the righteous person was in the city, he is its glory, he is its brilliance, he is its splendor. Once he left the city, the glory and the splendor and his brilliance also leaves with him. And then that means that there's something about the physical geographic location where the tzaddik lives that becomes transformed because of the tzaddik there. And when he leaves, it's no longer the same. And again, what is it? What are we talking about? We're talking about that there's a presence of Shekhinah, a presence of godliness there. Here's something similar and even more explicit. Look at the next page, 52. This is a story in the Chumash, which is about Yaakov, as we know, had two wives, Rachel and Leah. And here Yaakov was rebuking one of his sons, Reuven. Why was he rebuking him? Because he took Yaakov's bed, which was in the tent of Leah, Rachel, and he put it into the tent of his mother, which was Leah. And that was sort of interfering with the intimate life of Yaakov, and it was disrespectful. So he's rebuking him for it. But let's look what he says. So again, let's look at the top of the page. He said to Reuben, you're unstable like water. Just like water doesn't just stand, you're also unstable. You shall no longer be superior, for you have gone on your father's bed. You profaned my couch, my bed, by going up on it. But he didn't really go on the bed. He just moved the bed from one location to another location. So let's look into Rashi on the bottom where it's underlined. In the words in bold, you have gone up on your father's bed. You profaned it. So Rashi is like this. You profaned means you desecrated the one who hovers over my bed. What is that? The name of the Shekhinah that regularly hovers over my bed. Basically, Yaakov is saying that the Shekhinah hovers over his bed, and by you tampering with it, moving it from here to there, you are actually, besides what you did physically moving the bed, you are interfering with the presence of the Shekhinah that was there. So we see something incredible. This is talking about a physical object, a bed. And it's in context of something which is very physical and human. Yaakov living a life like everybody else is talking about his intimate life with his wife. And yet, what does the Torah tell us? There's a presence of godliness on his bed. And by moving it when you weren't supposed to, you have desecrated that presence of Hashem. And that's why he was punished. Yeah. Yeah. Reuben is the one that did it.
To move Yaakov's bed. But what's the problem? Why can't you just said then the Shekhinah move with them?
What's the problem? So in terms of the Gashmi, I told you, it's disrespectful to do that. Spiritually, it means like, let's think of it this way. Imagine someone would take the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash and move it from one spot where it's designated to stand and put it to another spot. Would it make a difference?
Yes.
Sure. Not only that, but halachically, if a person would light the menorah and not in its right spot, there's very severe consequences for that. Why? Because the answer is, if this is a menorah in the holy temple, every detail, the way it's designed and where it stands and all the details of the menorah are designed in a way that it corresponds to something spiritual. And by moving it out of its place where it's meant to be, you're affecting whatever is meant to be spiritually. I told the story in class once, and some of you who were here early in the year will remember it, but I guess it'll make it easier for us to understand. The story I told was that I was in 770, and I was talking to, it was actually my brother, and one of his students, a young boy, a 15, 16-year-old boy, walks over and says to him, "Can I borrow your cell phone, your iPhone?" He said, "Okay." and he takes the iPhone and he walks to a certain spot in the 770, and we're watching him, and it was really very strange. He has that cell phone, then he walks forward a little bit, and takes a few steps back, and he goes to the right, then he goes to the left, and goes here, then goes there. Then finally he stops, and he talks on the phone. And what is he doing this dance before he's speaking on the phone? What is it, some ritual you got to do before you speak on the phone? So when I came back, my brother says to him, so what was going on? I saw you dancing forward and back and going here and going there. So he says, no, in 770, you can see online what's happening. It's called 770 Live. You can watch 770 online. But you can't see the whole 770, just certain, it's a thing that moves. So you can see the northern part, the western part of it. So he says he's speaking to his mother, and she wanted to see him. So he stood, and her mother was telling him, move more to the right, I'll see it. So someone who doesn't understand, what's the difference where you stand, here or there? There's a difference. I'm standing here, I get the signal, and I'm connected, and she can see me. If I stand there, it doesn't correspond. And as you know, with your iPhones, you talk on the telephone, suddenly everything goes dead. What happened? Not getting the signals on this spot. In the dorm, I think you have that problem. There's certain places near the piano, near the window, you can't, the phone doesn't work. You have to move away. You have to move to another spot. Spiritually, every place, it has its spiritual connection. And definitely the Beis HaMikdash, if it's a holy place, everything has to be precise. If you look in the Torah, you see the measurements to the last inch, exactly where it's supposed to be, how long, how wide, how high, and where, so far from this wall and this far from that wall. And if it's not in the right spot, it could be that you're just destroying things spiritually in a way that you don't understand. So if Yaakov was a tzaddik of that caliber, and his bed was put in a certain place for the purpose of the Shekhinah, by tampering with it and moving it, you're affecting something that was meant to happen through his bed in terms of the Shekhinah manifesting. Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So we have page 53, which is something similar. We actually had this before, but look at page 653. That's the story where Moshe and all the elders and his father-in-law, they sat down to have a meal. And it says they sat down to have the meal before God. And Rashi obviously asks the question, doesn't spell out the question, but the question is obvious. Why does it say before God? It doesn't mention that God was there. So Rashi says, from here we learn that when you participate in a meal, that there are Torah scholars there are godly people there are righteous people there. It's considered, while you eat the food, what you're doing is you're taking food and you're digesting food, but it's as if you're enjoying the pleasure and the splendor of the Shekhinah, because the food has in it also godliness. Again, it's just food. It's a piece of bread. It's a piece of meat. It's a piece of fish. But let's think for a second. What about the food in the Beis HaMikdash? That was food that had in it holiness. In fact, if somebody was impure and he ate that food, again, there's a punishable by a very severe punishment, because this is desecrating the holiness, even though it's food. There's holiness and godliness in food. There's godliness in the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. There's godliness in the ark. There's godliness in the altar and the mizbeach. And there's godliness in the table and the food, that if tzaddikim are there, then the godly light that they carry manifests into the things that are in the area.
You're saying the godly like went into the food?
Yeah.
Even the carbon itself?
Even what?
The carbon, not carbon, just any carbon that required all the people to eat, and not just carbon.
I mean, there are different halachas, different karbanas, but generally speaking, if it's something that has kedusha in it, then a person's impure, is not allowed to eat it. What were you saying? I'm sorry.
Shekhinah went into the food.
Right. It's absorbed in the food, because there are tzaddikim in that room. What? Right. Being that we learned before that the tzaddikim carry the Shekhinah, with them comes the presence of the Shekhinah, so it also spreads to the things that are around them.
When we say Shekhinah, what do we mean? I'm referring to like Hashem is everywhere.
Hashem is everywhere.
Shekhinah is what, that it's more powerful?
Shekhinah means more manifest of Hashem's presence. There's a story in Gemara that illustrates what the Shekhinah is. The story in Gemara was someone, his name was Rabbi Gamliel, one of the sages, and he was approached by someone. I think it was someone who was maybe Jewish, but a man who had an issue with belief. And he said to him, "How many gods do you have?" Why is he asking? Because it says that wherever there are 10 Jews gathered together, a minyan, God is there. So how many gods do you have? There's so many shuls and so many minyanim. So he answered him, does the sun shine in your house? Yeah. Does it shine in your neighbor's house? Of course. And many other places. How many suns are there? He says there's one sun. But the sunlight shines in different places. And the sunlight will only shine in a place where the windows are open and there's nothing blocking it. But that's the sunlight. The sun itself is one. Hashem is one. And Hashem is beyond, he's everywhere. But where is Hashem's light manifest when there's an openness to receive it? And that's Torah, mitzvahs, righteousness, and so on. So the famous, you probably heard this, is a famous quote from a certain Chassidic Rebbe, where someone said, where is God? And he answered, wherever you let him in. But if you let him in, he's there. What does it mean? Because he is everywhere regardless. But whether you'll sense him, whether you'll feel him, whether he's there in a more conscious, revealed way, depends. If I remove anything that's blocking, then you'll feel him. And if you do things that blocks his presence, you won't feel him. But so when we say Shekhinah, it means revealed godliness. That's what the definition of Shekhinah is. Now there's another thing, and that is that if there's Shekhinah, then it also brings blessing. Hashem is the source of all blessing. And really, in essence, being that Hashem is the creator of the universe, he's the source of everything, the whole world should be filled only with blessing and goodness and kindness and happiness. The fact that there are things that are not that way is only because God's presence is hidden, concealed. If his presence would be totally revealed and not concealed at all, there would be only light, no darkness, figuratively speaking. And that's the way it'll be when Mashiach comes. So if you have something that there's more godly light there, it's more revealed godliness, the godliness in it is more manifest, it'll also mean that there will be more bracha, it'll bring more blessing. So here's an example. We read the story quickly last week, but let's look at it again. I want to focus on a certain detail. Remember the story that there was a woman, that the Navi, there was a prophet, his name was Elisha, and she was a hostess. He would come to their home, and she gave him an apartment where he was able to stay. And he asked her, how can I bless you? And his assistant said she has no children. He gave her a blessing for a child. And then one day the child was very young, maybe 7 years old, and he died on her laps. And then she ran to the Navi, remember the story? And he brought him back to life. Before she ran, what did she do with the child? Let's look at the words inside. I'm looking at page 54 now. Let's just read from verse 18. The child grew up. One day he went out to his father, to the reapers in the field, and he said to his father, my head, meaning it hurts. And the father said to the servant, carry him to his mother. He carried him, brought him to his mother. He sat on her knees until noon, and he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, being that he had an apartment there. So she went up to his apartment. Of course, he wasn't there. Put him down on the bed. He only used the apartment when he was traveling. Put him on the bed, closed the door, and she left. And where did she go? She went to the Navi for a blessing. Why did she put him on the bed? Why did she do that? So if you look at the bottom of the page where there's an arrow,
Who's the man of God?
Elisha, Hanavi, he was the prophet.
Oh, she laid him on his bed.
Right. And verse 21, on the bottom, this is the commentary called Ralbag. I made an arrow pointing to the Hebrew and an arrow pointing to the English. And she laid him on the bed of the godly man of God. So you turn the page, to page 55. She thought that in Elisha's merit, he would be preserved. In other words, preserved until she goes and brings the prophet here to bring him back to life. She therefore laid the child on his bed. So what does it mean? What does it have to do with putting him on his bed? So obviously it means because this was the bed of a tzaddik, and we just learned by Yaakov that the bed of a righteous person has the Shekhinah there. If the Shekhinah is there, there's more Shekhinah, then there's more bracha, there's more blessing. And she was hoping that that would bring the blessing to the child that would eventually lead to him come back and bring him back to life. Another source that wherever there is godliness and godliness in a revealed way, there's also blessing in a revealed way, is the next page, 56. This is telling the story of the ark. Before they built the Beis HaMikdash, the ark, the Aron, and the Luchas, which is the holiest article, not only in the Beis HaMikdash, but in the whole world, that didn't have its place. And they made a big celebration to bring the ark to the Yerushalayim. But then something happened and they had to stop whatever they were doing. And then they let the ark be in someone's home for 3 months. The person was Oved Edom Hagiti. And look where it's underlined, what it says. The ark remained in the house of Oved Edom Hagiti for 3 months. And Hashem blessed him and his entire household. There was a lot of blessing in their family. King David was told, Hashem blessed the house of Edom, and everything has become because of the ark of God. Was the connection. So clearly you see, being that Hashem is the source of life, Hashem is the source of blessing, so in a place where there's more godly presence, there's going to be more godliness and more life and more light and more blessing. Wherever there is more, if Hashem is the source of life, He is the source of blessing and the source of life. So wherever there is more revealed godliness, there's going to be more revealed blessing and more revealed life. So when she saw that the child is sick, she brought him to a place that had a physical object, but it was the object of the tzaddik. And she believed that because there's a presence of godliness in this bed, it'll give him more bracha. And that's the source of the custom of Chassidim, where it comes from. And here's another thing, which is even more fascinating. The next page, I don't have this in English, so I'll just give it to you. I'll read the words in Hebrew. This is a Gemara that tells a story, page 57. Of a certain very complicated thing in Torah that nobody knew how to explain it. And then it says there was an older man from Golil, and he didn't know how to explain it better than everybody else. So they asked him, how come you were able to understand something which none of us could understand? Like, what gave you that extra strength that you can do something that we can't? You missing pages or something?
Yeah. Mine just out of order.
Out of order?
Just 1 page is fine.
Mm-hmm. So you have page 57?
Yeah, I have it.
You got it, just not in the right order. Okay. So the Gemara says the part that's underlined in Hebrew reads like this. He said like this, I have the stick that used to belong to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir was one of the outstanding sages we mentioned the other day. He's known as Rabbi Meir Bal Hanes. And this Rabbi Meir had a stick. And this man had Rabbi Meir's stick. V'hi melamedes lideya, and this stick is teaching me Torah. How could a stick teach you Torah? Unless there was a hidden tape recorder inside the stick. And it was recording all his shiurim while he had it, but there were no tape recorders in those days. So obviously what it means is that being that the stick was with him, even though it's a physical object, it absorbed that godliness and the godly light and the godliness that was in the stick gave him additional blessing, not only physically that someone who's sick could become well, it also gave him blessing in terms of his spiritual progress, that he should be able to understand Torah better than other people because he had this stick in his hand. So in other words,
someone else took one of Saddic's.
right, he had this tzaddik stick. He was also a Torah scholar himself, but somehow he displayed superiority in his knowledge over all these other sages. And they asked him, how come you have this understanding? None of us could figure it out. And he said, I have this stick, and that stick gave me the ability and the power to understand Torah better than everybody else because of the stick. I'm bringing all this in where we see sources that, yes, it is true in Gemara that a person who's a tzaddik, not only is he himself filled with godly light, but also the object that he's connected to, whether it's the location that he lives, the house that he lives in, the bed that he sleeps on, and for that case, the table where he eats and the chair that he sits on, all these things, even though they're physical objects, but they're different. They have a certain presence of godliness in it. And that has also the power to bring bracha so when people that say are ready to pay thousands of dollars because they want to have an object that belonged to the most famous baseball player, that's something else, the famous baseball player, a celebrity, and I have something belong to him. We're talking about something real, that there's a certain holiness and a certain aspect of godly light in this object, because when a tzaddik is involved with something, the godliness within him shines and extends to everything around him.
The idea of wearing, let's say, a yarmulke or whatever is what?
Same idea. That when you wear, someone has a yarmulke of the Rebbe, or wears something that belongs to the Rebbe, or has an object, this adds bracha to that person, physically and spiritually.
Because the godliness is revealed in it?
Right. And here we see another thing based on this. I mean, you probably know that there's a custom amongst Chassidim that when the Kala is getting married, the day that she gets married, not the day, but at the chuppah, she covers her face. And the custom is to try to get material of something that the Rebbe used, or was the Rebbe. And we have one in the dorm. People come to the dorm to use that. It's called a dektich. But what it is, if I remember correctly, this was a gift that the Rebbetzin gave the dorm. And it's made from, I think it was a scarf that the Rebbe wore. So what does it have to do with a wedding? And the answer is, it's an object that belongs to a tzaddik. It contains in it a certain aspect of godliness. And on the day of your wedding, you want to have the biggest level and degree of bracha. This will enhance the brachas that you have on that day. And the same with the chassan, puts on a shirt of the Rebbe or a yarmulke. People look for something, an object that belonged to the Rebbe, to wear it or have it near them at the time, and that will add bracha to them. And even though there are those who will say, wow, that's so extreme, where does it come from? This is made up stuff. So I just want you to know it's not made up stuff. There's one source and another source and another source and another source. That the object of a tzaddik brings bracha. We don't have enough time to go into the next piece. I guess we'll do that tomorrow. And that's about Eretz Yisrael. What does it mean that it's a holy land? The same idea. It's a land that the Shekhinah, God's presence, is revealed in this land. And we'll soon see something really incredible that the Gemara says about the difference between a person who lives in Eretz Yisrael or a person who lives outside of Eretz Yisrael. To be continued tomorrow. Here's Hashem. Yeah.